to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Tim Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, why do people get out of bed, and what is coercive violence? So, Tim, why did you get out of bed today?
Well, I won't answer that question directly yet, but I'm going to answer why I asked this question. I think these are two questions which need answering, or a discussion of the answers might be pertinent to do. I asked, why do people have children in an older episode, which had a decent amount of views, and I thought that was a very interesting episode. One reason people get out of beds is because they have kids they have to take care of. Since they are either, duty bound, instinct bound, or love them, then they get out of bed, take care of their offspring. It's no different than any other animal in the animal kingdom, or a bird, or a fish, or something like that. Now, in industrial modernity with division of labor, this may look a little bit different, but the end result is basically the same. People get out of bed to take care of the offspring, and so to speak. They obviously work in different areas. They do. As David Friedman stated in his debate with Ben Burgess, I think Brent Langel was there. There was a thing known as natural scarcity. Like when the bird goes to collects materials for its offspring. It's not like they just exist in natural quantities. They have to be. Now, there's not as much finishing variety going on, but they have to be gathered. In the same way with humans, humans have to, crops have to be planted. House builders have to take materials and build to make housing. So you could ask, why is there a bed and house and food that's heated to begin with? Why is there a bed to begin with? I mean, you get Hans Hoppe's, a brief history of mankind. You have to ask these things. Yes, there are things like zoning and absentee landowners. Yes, there's things like that, private and public theft, large scale exploitation, and so forth. But that's not the entire story. That's not the entire story. I think it's a mistake if libertarians think the reason most people are poor is because IP. Maybe it's 10 to 20%, but it's not. Or reason why certain places, there's things like that. I think it's not the entire story. So this is a long way of answering the question of why people in general get out of bed. By asking there's a bed in the first place. So in rich countries, United States, Britain, the Scandinavian countries, Japan, that have fairly well-developed welfare systems. In a sense, you can get up, but you don't need to work. Now, whether this is universalizable, both on like the country level, because it could be that like there's some sort of version of, Kantian effects and third worldism is true, whereby rich countries can do things that, like Ghana, for example, can't do. Or it could be that, Norway is just like a sort of just exists off U.S. military hegemony, and he doesn't have to spend anything on the military. There could be and oil money. There could be individual cases that allow this to happen here. So in certain countries, it does exist, contrary to what Jimmy Dore and Ben Burgess think, quite effective welfare. Even in the United States, there's Obamacare. Even in the United States, there is a threadbare welfare system, food stamps, various other things that exist. So are there cracks? Yes. But as Moldbug would point out, many of the people who are actually homeless either to some extent want to be there, or they're dangerous to the housing / homeless shelters. Like there are people that are just like quote unquote dangerous, and unless you want to like forcibly drug them or whatever, you don't want to, you kind of don't want them around the more, so to speak, normal homeless population, so to speak. So and I'm going to ask this again: can this be made universal? I mean, this is the dream of the UBI utopianists. Everyone can just, and this is where movies like Wall-E, I think, are genuine movies. And Mark Fisher, of course, we discussed him before, along with McIntyre and Moldbug on an earlier episode. He would say that Wall-E is kind of like a half-baked dystopia in that sense. Like it is just where everyone just they just stay in these chairs all day. So why do people get out of bed? I mean, the Marx, I should say Hegelian Zizek joked precisely that he got into debate with liberal and just asked the question straight up. Why don't you just drink lemonade, watch porn, and then when you get bored of that, just go shoot yourself? To me, it's a very candid question coming out of Zizek in a debate he had with a liberal here. There's another movie that sort of just that explores this. It stars Sean Connery. It's about a space mining colony where the master slash boss overworks everybody, but he does also pay off all his workers with sex and drugs. It seems like in some ways, and a lot of the workers, the backstory suggests, are just like half cons who can't get jobs elsewhere. So it's a kind of like a work colony, but there's also a lot of like visceral low pleasures in the sort of normal sense here. To answer the question of why I get out of bed, I can get by because I want to buy stuff that I want or need. If there was a UBI check that was actually genuine that's sent to me, I don't know. This is one of those things where people are jealous of rich people, really rich people, or that, but they should be careful about that because like there is some sort of way in which people who work, you have a task, you have some sort of meeting, even it's a total BS job in the David Graeber sense. And by the way, the libertarians have their own theory of BS jobs. Think bureaucrats, think politicians, think regulators. They have their own theory of BS jobs as well. So and it's also like it's out of a kind of egoism, like if you just stay in bed all the time, you're kind of like just a deadbeat in a sense. You're kind of it's not. It doesn't look like a very particularly quote unquote good life. You may as well just kill yourself already if that's really what you think life. It's kind of like an anti-life here. And also, I get out of bed because on some level, I think that there might be a God, and I think that would be a bad way to live. So that's another reason why I get out of bed. There might be a God. I don't know like all the particular details, but it seems like that's not a very good thing to do, just to stay in bed all day. That just seems like a bad thing to do. But it does seem like, in some ways, many people are just forced out of it via natural scarcity, the state, some sort of ism, capitalism, liberalism, neoliberalism, bossism, and so forth. So, Swithin, why do you get out of bed? What do you think of my comments of why people in general get out of bed? And I mean, is that in some sense a bad life if you just stay in bed, all day? Is that in some sense a bad life by almost any standard? Swithin?
Yes, I think it is. As to why people get out of bed, yeah, I mean, clearly a lot of people, as you point out, get out of bed just so that they can survive. Then you've got to ask the question, well, why do they want to survive? Well, there seems to be some sort of innate instinct that death is bad. If you want to take a sort of Aristotelian approach to sort of the metaphysics of good and evil, to quote a book by David Oderberg, being the only things that can be good are things that are existent, and so to be a good human, you must continue to exist. Now, there are other considerations in certain circumstances and things, but you should never actively seek your own death, and actually continuing to exist and be the fullness of what you are, which so basically you have more actuality of your nature. So, for instance, to be a more actual human would mean to, well, obviously have like 4 limbs rather than 3, or something along those lines. That would be a relatively straightforward example. And of course, you need the unifying function for you to continue to exist, and so therefore you need to stay alive. Oh, as an aside on this is the idea that why God is the most good thing possible, because God is fullness of being, because he lacks absolutely nothing, and therefore is sort of metaphysically ultimate in that sense. So I think the interesting question beyond that, though, is why do people who don't need to get out of bed? So those who've got maybe welfare checks so that they can have all their normal existence continue. So I suppose you've got those people. The question is, well, why did they bother to get out of bed and do things? I think that's the interesting question. I believe the playwright Samuel Beckett for a long time kind of stayed in bed and didn't do anything. He was very rich, well, I think comparatively, from his plays. Waiting for Godot, I think, probably his most famous one. And so he was, I think it's a bit like the existentialist. He kind of like just stay in bed and is like, oh no, the world is going to end. Everyone's going to die, so what's the point? Which actually ties in nicely with an old Philosophy of Bites episode, which was life after death. And it's like, well, how would your actions be meaningful? Supposing that you are trying to cure cancer, and you think, oh, that's kind of a meaningful activity. But if you take the view that everyone's going to die anyway, what's the point? Ultimately, even you might never actually cure cancer, and even if you did, they would die of something anyway. So to what extent, is that's just prolonging the inevitable as opposed to reversing it? And so that kind of critique of anything, of why anyone does anything, the existentialist, I think is quite interesting. That said, why do people get out of bed to do something even if they don't have to? I think because humans have the innate drive to feel like they are useful and provide something of value, not only to themselves but to other people. So even if you're like a real autiste and you just sort of like doing your own thing, you yourself think that's valuable, but also if you're like let's take you for like an academic type, you're searching for the sake of searching for it. I mean, you kind of feel like you want to contribute and influence other people because you think you're right and everybody else is wrong, maybe on metaphysics or aesthetics or ethics or something like that. That's what you want to do. Because some of the kids I had a number of years ago, I got into the activity like, where do you want to be when I think you were either 30 or 40? They were like 16 to 18. And one of the questions they asked me, what would you do if you were like a billionaire? And they always came up with stuff that they would actually do, because there's only so much sort of, consumption. I don't want to use that in a purely pejorative sense of sort of like the left tends to do, or some Christian right, or no, consumption is bad. But there seems to be a situation whereby if you are just sort of consuming and you're not providing or doing anything, that's kind of bad and lacking in something. And so that's why I think people do things. And this can actually even be things like, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cycle from one end of the country to the other because, well, that'd be good to do. And in a way, that's kind of production. You are doing something. It's a lot more active. Obviously, it's a continuum, because you could argue, well, you're a critic if you're binge watching Netflix series. However, I suppose if you were, and I think I did mention this to them, if I ended up doing that, I'd probably end up creating a YouTube channel of reviewing stuff. And then it would turn into some sort of like quasi-journalistic existence of mine. Because I would sort of convert something that was kind of a hobby into something that was kind of creative at the same time. So barring, actual direct, you need to survive and to eat, and that's why you need to work, I think people want to feel like they're useful and doing something valuable, and that requires being more significantly active in things which watching stuff at TV at home isn't. And that would be my answer to the question.
So during the 2020, comedian Tim Dillon, who I actually liked more during then, he's become more bland lately. He got into an argument / bit over, they were saying, well, because people aren't being forced to work at their boring jobs, people are going to start community gardens. People are going to, read a bunch of great books or something like that. So there's this annoying left-wing, left libertarian Chomsky fantasy where if you just got rid of the big evil capitalists, everything would be, so to speak, better. I don't think that happened. People just stayed home and binge watched Netflix here. So as bad as you think, as bad as people say these jobs at like Walmart or McDonald's or other things, it does seem like the opportunity cost for many people is actually negative if they're not working. Brian Kaplan has a great lecture on, why do people. Basically, you can say happiness surveys are dubious, and I think they are dubious. But it seems like the people who, work seem to be quote unquote more happy than the people who don't work. And like the unemployed. Now, again, this all could be explained by selection effects. This all could be explained by selection effects to some extent, but that doesn't really answer the question per se either. It still seems like the people who are unemployable will be better off if they had a task to do than if they were just, given welfare or some very generous welfare program. Regardless if that's universalizable in the true macro sense here. So my comment here with regard to this is, it seems like many people actually, even though the capitalist or the feudal or whatever neo-feudal, neoliberal, whatever system you want to say, it seems like that being forced to work does, in a strange roundabout sense, make people better off. And if you look at people who get Social Security disability in the United States or are forced to get early retirement for a few years, as as Tyler Cowen would point out, once 67 or the whatever age that is the age of retirement rolls out, people's views on themselves increase. So it's like one thing to be retired, like they say, like if there's a period of 3 to 4 years where they have to, just exist on disability, their opinions of themselves are lower than when, they reach a certain age where it's viewed as socially acceptable not to work, so to speak. So my point here regarding work is, if you look at someone like Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, like the Bidens aren't the richest family in the United States or the world by no means, but they have enough money floating out. Or Chelsea Clinton, by the way. But Hunter Biden is in some sense a textbook case of a child of a wealthy person who has who lives a bad life. I mean, he basically has a BS job and just has Ukrainian hookers and takes a bunch of drugs. I mean, in a strange sense, if you got rid of, if everyone, would everyone end up like, would everyone end up like that? Like, I mean, in a strange sense, if he was forced to work at a real job, he might not have ended up like that. So, in a strange sense, you could say Hunter Biden is a product of his privileged circumstances, and because most people don't have easy access to expensive Ukrainian hookers or drugs and the ability to get away with it to that degree and do absolutely nothing here. But in this, he is. I look at him as like a textbook example. There's also other children of, like, so to speak, wealthy people. Trump, for example, just bring up a child of a wealthy person. As much as people criticize him, they'll say, well, if he just put it in TD Ameritrade money market account earning 2% interest, he'd actually be worth more money than him creating, a fine entertainment mogul dynasty. Well, maybe. He also could have just went like crazy, just doing nothing all day. So there just doesn't seem to be like a social cost of, like, doing nothing is not zero. It's like it's hard to do nothing, and you end up just doing really base activities. And actually, the people like, the people who have the money to do like the base activities in real life, they don't seem to be particularly quote unquote happy. Now, maybe there's some way in their head that there's some like way to measure it, but like that just seems basically false. It seems like working on some sort of task. If Hunter Biden wrote just fiction novels that that no one read, it seems like that would be a better existence than what he did otherwise here. So that's my example. What do you make of that? What do you make of, like, welfare? It seems like in COVID we had a mini run of it, and a lot of people just watched Netflix or watched porn or just ate. Obesity went up during COVID. That's in a sense like this sort of pod life. What do you make of that, Swithin?
Well, I think you're right. Yeah, that tends to happen. I mean, with the sort of like sons of the rich. I mean, that's why they sort of ended up living lives of luxury and sort of like becoming gamblers and losing the fortune and stuff. When the problem is when you get to you're sufficiently rich, you need to impose your own constraints, but very few people seem to be very capable of doing that. That's why, for instance, the aristocracy sent their boys off to very hard. Well, according to what they'd done, one of the reasons they did it was because they sent their sons off to very harsh boarding schools to instill discipline and things in them, so that when they could have access to like the family fortune or they succeeded their father as lord, they would actually be competent and wouldn't just decide, well, you know what I can do? I can just blow all the money and have fun. So yeah, when you do get, in a way, not having to work creates some sort of social problems if the people aren't sufficiently directed. And I think this is why you need sort of leaders. And in a way, you could think like some form of social shaming is like, you shouldn't be staying at home doing that. You should actually do something useful. And that would actually kick people into gear. But again, I think you need to recognize that a lot of people simply just wouldn't do anything. Now, they might hate themselves, but they would sort of lack initiative to do things. If they were guided by people around them who could provide and help them find purpose, then I think they would be useful and productive, and they would enjoy their lives more. Probably, it's just that for many people, the social structures are not in place to facilitate that. Um, and this is the standard libertarian line, but insofar as it's more difficult to set up your own business and side hustles and stuff, it makes it relatively less attractive. And so, someone could have made something of themselves but didn't, because they were prevented from doing so. So yeah, I think you're right. A lot of people would just sit down and do nothing. They might try and do something, but then with I'll watch Netflix again, and then just kind of get into the cycle of a downward spiral, which I suppose actually is where children come in, because children give you an innate purpose to make you do stuff. Which is why, of course, you get to the midlife crisis. It's because, well, you've done everything, and it's like, what do I do now? Because, well, got the wife, got the kids, financially pretty secure. What's the point? But insofar as the kids take up your time to do stuff with them, they give you direction. And so I suppose, I don't think I've mentioned this, but why do children have kids? It kind of gives them something to do. And I don't mean that in a very trite sense. I mean, it actually does give them something to do, which makes them feel more valuable and probably enjoy their life more.
So Swithin, what would count as non-coercive violence towards in terms of getting out of bed? Because it seems like the dream of Kevin Carson or Ben Burgess is basically the UBI society, which is very generous universal basic income society. That basically provides all your direct needs. And if it provides all your direct needs, in a sense, everyone could not to maybe the scale that Hunter Biden or some other children of a wealthy person could live, but to enough of a level that you could foreseeably, modestly live a life of just the sort of Huxley's dystopia of just base pleasures being fed through your brain here. Um, if that well, first of all, you could ask the question: is that realizable in a sense? And I'm sort of on the fence here. I mean, there is an argument that we could have flying cars, and if you assume that, you might get there. I mean, Keynes thought everyone would work 20 hours a week in the future and spend the rest of the time reading books and arguing. I mean, it's funny certain intellectuals' views on what people would end up being. Um, I think Tim Dillon, the comedian, is actually have a better view of sociology than Keynes does in this sense here. People choose that, but they're forced to go to work in a sense. Like people say they have to go to work. In a sense, they do have to go to work, like because in many instances, welfare is not as good as you say it is, as the state is say it is. Which you could say that's a good thing. You could say if you're Ben Burgess, you would say that's a bad thing. But there's huge cracks, and you also somewhat, as Michel Foucault would argue, you become dependent on the state. You sort of become a state ward in a sense. So if the state wants to go to war, you could, you're more. There's all sorts of ways which it used to control you too. So it could be that this UBI fantasy is just never will happen, or if it does happen, will happen in a way that almost a lot of people reject it. I mean, a lot of people wanted to continue working during COVID, but were forced not to. FYI, but like that's, but so then in a sense you could say, well, what I'm describing is not really coercive violence. It's voluntarily choosing to do something. And it gets sort of a free will discussion where Richard Swinburne would say, well, free will just means no one's pointing a gun to your head. If no one's pointing a gun to your head, then, like, in a sense, your decision was free. It's just a sort of normal use of the words free and will. It doesn't mean like pre-neural brain firing processes and things like that. That has nothing to do with it. In the sort of standard English usage of the words, it means that you freely chose to do X, Y, or Z. And in this sense, I think people's employment decisions, it's vague. And I do think your points about let's say it'd be easier to start a business than other if regulations were less, or IP didn't exist. I do think that matters, but I don't think that's the entire story 100% here. And I think you've agreed on that before. I've asked you this question before here. So you could ask how realizable this scenario is, but what do you think people's levels of like working, and what do you think would be the applicable amount of violence to be applied in this society? You could say one really rich person or rich corporation. You can imagine this in Kapistan, who just sends everyone's checks every day or enough to buy just enough goods to survive. It's some really hedge fund, like some sort of virtuous hedge fund or whatever, that sends everyone checks every day, just enough to survive. I mean, what would be the social effects of this? Like in under this scenario, would the left libertarians say jobs now are in some sense free? I doubt it, but I'm not sure. I mean, left libertarians like to praise gift economies, but like as we've stated in our one of our episodes, the most normal use of a gift economies is not friends, it's in family. And left libertarians' relationship with family is like when you push someone, they probably will say marriage is a form of state sanctioned slavery or something like that. They'll probably say something bizarre like that. Now, whether the regards to children is a little more complicated here, but that's why I started with children. Children give people a reason to get up out of bed every morning. But in some sense, it's coercive because if that child, like especially if you're young enough, that child will just die. Maybe not when they're 5, children can survive, but like 1, 2, they're basically entirely helpless in that sense. So it does give you a kind of purpose here. So I sort of rambled there. What did you say is coercive violence? And what are your comments on this UBI system? There's different ways you could set up. Would it just lead everyone to be like some mini version of like Hunter Biden, or like some mini version of Huxley's nightmare, if indeed work is abolished?
So is your question? Would the UBI get rid of the sort of quote unquote coercive violence to get a job, as the left libertarians might think that? Oh well, have a job.
Yes.
Would he get rid of it? Well, I mean, insofar as the left libertarians want to define the term, probably, because you wouldn't be forced to do something to survive. You would just survive because, well, your needs would be met. Then the question is, well, what would people do? I mean, that's an interesting question. I think that's going to be very dependent on the social structures that exist. But if you had a society, well, I suppose in the current society, you probably would get people who didn't work. I think eventually that might lead to some of economic breakdown. Primarily because it just encourages high time preference. So there's no point doing anything. I can do this now, and I'll get free stuff. So I mean, this is one of my arguments I use to explain why actually welfare might actually increase lifetime income inequality rather than reduce it, because it disincentivizes the work if you're going for promotion at work to get a higher income, which then means you can then start ascending the work ladder. But instead, rather it stays at the lowest level because he'd rather get home and watch the football. Because, well, he doesn't need the extra money. Why? Because, well, he's got welfare checks. So I do think that could be a problem. I mean, the interesting question I think here would be to say, let's suppose we had a society, you mentioned Ancapistan, let's suppose you have this highly technological like AI society in which let's just say that all basic needs are basically produced automatically, and maybe you can purchase the equipment required to feed you, like the replicators in Star Trek, for like a tiny amount of money. So you'd have to work for like 1 second to be able to afford it, something like that. So you could then say, well, the production to keep everyone alive isn't required. And then the question is, what will people do then? I think in today's society, a lot of them would end up just watching TV. I do think that's probably the case. Probably because of social structures not being as strong as they are in less technologically developed societies. You might get some family pushback to go and do something. And I suppose for men, it would be a case of, well, insofar as you're more successful, you might be able to attract a better woman in that case. But as I say, in our current kind of technological society in which you can live pretty isolated lives, those people who actually wanted to make something themselves would do. The question is whether those sort of like social groupings that they would create would actually be large enough to get people to actually join them. or would they just not hear about them or not? I think it's going to depend. So I think that you've got the self-motivated people who do things anyway, and then there's people who will do things if they feel like they should, and that's kind of an imposed obligation by other people. Obligations are going to come from relationships, not from the state, because you don't really have a relationship with the state or a faceless bureaucracy. So it would depend then on the ubiquity of sort of social clubs and extended family units and things to make it so that they might do things. Otherwise, a lot of people simply, I think, wouldn't do anything. I think they would hate themselves for doing it, but I just don't think they would kick themselves into gear to actually do anything.
Correct. So I think your comments about how welfare might increase income inequality are entirely correct. You should look at Richard. I've heard him. Richard Epstein's a popularizer of this idea. I mean, and then on the other side, it's like Michel Foucault would say, just creates dependency in the worst way, and I think it does. Maybe on the sort of very low levels, it's necessary, in a sense, but it gets expanded to too many, sort of big, too many people in that sense. And actually, by the way, charity mutual aid gets crowded out by state welfare as well. So that's a sort of way in which local people can actually, so to speak, help each other and provide value, and so to speak. So rather than having a nursing home, your one of your grandchildren goes takes care of, or one of your nieces goes take care of you. I mean, again, but this goes back to like the gift economy ideal, which a lot of like left libertarians like to talk about. But like in practice, that just looks like family, which most left libertarians have a side of a. They have good points on being critical of family, but they have a very low. They have a mixed view on it, so to speak, a mixed view on its origins, its how it's run, and actually many of their views on feminism end up being like women, instead of taking care of their children, should go out and work for Walmart, and so forth. So in that sense, you know, but I would say that for as much as the isms of capitalism, as well as historical isms of slavery, feudalism, whatever economic system you say existed in the Middle Ages, it does force people to work. If working makes people on average happy, better off in some sort of genuine sense of the good life. Brian Kaplan had debate with Elizabeth Brunig, and one thing that Brunig, I mean, in a strange sense, I agree with Brunig only insofar as I do think there is a thicker sense of what is the good life. I do think it's fine to go to McDonald's, Brian Kaplan, but I do think there is a sense in which the LOL libertarians sometimes do at times, not to say that Brian Kaplan is one, but I do think there is a sense. But the problem for Brunig is people don't naturally choose to work, and she knows that. And most like people like Ben Burgess know that people don't choose to work. But it seems like, in a strange sense, everyone would just look like Hunter Biden, if there was a sufficiently generous welfare system in a sufficiently libertine society. Now maybe there wouldn't be free Ukrainian hookers for Biden, but there would be enough stuff out there that like, and that just looks like a life that looks like a dystopia here. So that the abolishment of like coerced work uh, seems to be dubious here. Yeah, I do agree that no one would go into a coal mine unless they're well paid. Today, most coal miners in the United States are very well paid for not well paid compared to certain tasks and jobs. Like they have benefits, they might have other things and so forth. They're well paid enough. Like I know the fracking workers are generally fairly well paid. I'm not saying they're rolling in money, but it seems like there is a coercive act to working, and it seems like you could just say the idea of abolishing work will never happen. It's kind of like a unicorn. There should be no agency. That it's sort of like the benevolent dictator. There might every once in a while there might be one, but to assume this is going to go forward is just a fiction dystopia or utopia. So that would be my overall comments. I mean, I get out of bed in the morning because I think it's better to do so than not to do so. And there's also the previous questions like why there is a bed to begin with, and like why is there a society to begin with. So it could be that you just need to. There's some amount of work. The two main worldviews. I've said this before: evolution and some kind of Christianity. Both of them seem to imply some amount of work, because in the evolutionary world, we sort of live in this car crash. Most of the yes, cats sleep 18 hours a day, but they do have to find other things. Things like animals like cows and other things like giraffes, zebras, the grazing animals, they work a lot. I mean, they're always, in some sense, wandering around looking for food. So if you lose animal parallels up to humans, other animals work. We're omnivores, so we're somewhere in between. And then as far as like the Christianity concerns, it seems like work existed in the garden. It seems like it's not. It is somewhat of part of the curse, but it seems like you wouldn't just, sit in a pod being fed base pleasure. So that's my overall comments about why people get out of bed in the morning and what is coercive violence. If you have any further comments on it, that'd be great. Thanks for doing this episode.
So I'd agree with the Bible and the garden, the man was supposed to work, and also that the world was uncultivated and was wild, and task was to cultivate it. It's just that it was significantly more hard work following the fall. That's at least a biblical narrative. So yeah, even there, work is intended to take place. We mentioned welfare crowds out private charity. I mean, I mentioned to people, if you were setting up your own sort of charitable organization, I mean, people who can't work, I mean, you probably try and help them out. That's fine. But the people who could in principle work, I mean, you might try and help them get on the straight and narrow. But insofar as they refused and didn't do anything, then you cut the money and you wouldn't give them any. So having UBI and having just things on a plate for you not having done anything at all is not a particularly virtuous feedback loop. So I mean that I don't think that controversial really. So yeah, UBI for all probably wouldn't end up being a utopia. And now I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.